After my surgery, my daughter-in-law handed me papers. "Sign these, we need this vacation." I smiled. I had already transferred everything. On Monday, she discovered she would have to live on the streets. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached." The hospital room was too bright, too sterile. I could still feel the lingering effects of anesthesia clouding my mind as I adjusted myself against the stiff pillows. 3 days after open-heart surgery, and every movement sent dull waves of pain across my chest. "Mom, you have a visitor," the nurse announced cheerfully, stepping aside to reveal Amara standing in the doorway. My daughter-in-law's perfectly manicured nails clutched her designer purse as she plastered on that familiar smile, the one that never quite reached her eyes. In the 7 years since Keith had married her, I'd grown accustomed to that smile. Cold, calculating. "Velma, look at you, sitting up already." Amara's voice was honey-sweet as she glided into the room, expensive perfume drowning out the antiseptic smell. "We've all been so worried." I nodded weakly, watching as she placed a small bouquet of flowers on the side table, the cheapest arrangement. From the hospital gift shop, I noted, Keith was nowhere to be seen. "Where's my son?" I asked, my voice still raspy from the breathing tube they'd removed yesterday. "Oh, he's swamped at work. You know how it is." Amara waved dismissively, settling herself into the visitor's chair. "But he sends his love." I doubted that. Keith hadn't visited once since my surgery. The son who once called me every day now seemed to exist only in Amara's carefully crafted excuses. "I actually brought something that needs your attention," Amara continued, pulling out a manila envelope from her purse. "Just some papers that need signing." "Papers?" I questioned, eyeing the envelope with suspicion. "Nothing major," she assured me, her smile tightening. "Keith and I are planning a family vacation to Hawaii, and we need to secure the financing. The bank needs your signature since you're still listed as a co-owner on some accounts." She opened the envelope and spread several documents across my lap, pointing to highlighted signature lines. "Just sign here, here, and here. It's mostly formalities." My hand trembled slightly as I reached for the pen she offered, but it wasn't from weakness. It was anger. Did she really think I wouldn't notice what these papers actually were? Transfer of property deeds, power of attorney. Documents that would effectively sign over my house, my home of 45 years, directly to them. "Hawaii sounds lovely," I said quietly, looking down at the papers. "When are you planning to go?" "Next month," Amara replied quickly, her eyes fixed on the pen in my hand. "We thought it would be good to get away after everything." Her gaze flicked meaningfully to my surgical scar, partially visible above my hospital gown. I nodded slowly, as if considering. "And Keith approved all this?" "Of course," she said, a flash of irritation crossing her face before she composed herself. "He's the one who suggested I bring these by. Said you wouldn't mind signing." I bet he did. My son, who once had such a kind heart, now reduced to sending his wife to trick his ailing mother. I felt a heaviness that had nothing to do with my recent surgery. I looked down at the papers again, then slowly signed each one, my signature shaky but legible. With each stroke of the pen, I watched Amara's smile grow wider, more genuine in its greed. "Thank you, Velma," she said, quickly gathering the papers and sliding them back into the envelope. "This means so much to us. I'll make sure the bank processes everything right away." I just smiled. A small, knowing smile that Amara mistook for the tired expression of an old woman who didn't understand what she'd just done. "You get some rest now," Amara said, patting my hand condescendingly. "I'll tell Keith you're doing well." As she strutted out of the room, clutching her precious envelope, I leaned back against the pillows and closed my eyes. If only she knew. If only she knew that 3 months ago, I had already transferred ownership of my house into a protected trust. If only she knew that the accounts she thought she was gaining access to had been emptied and closed weeks earlier. If only she knew that the papers she was so eager to file would lead to nothing but embarrassment and the harsh reality that she and Keith would soon have nowhere to live. I wasn't a fool. I'd seen the way they looked at my house when they thought I wasn't watching. I'd overheard their whispered conversations about when Mom's gone and what we'll do with her things. I'd noticed how they'd stopped bringing my grandchildren to visit unless they wanted something. The pain in my chest sharpened, but it wasn't from my surgery. It was the pain of betrayal. The pain of realizing that my own son, the little boy I'd raised alone after his father died, the child I'd sacrificed everything for, had become someone I no longer recognized, but I wasn't going to let them win. Not this time. Monday would come soon enough. And with it, Amara would discover exactly what happens when you underestimate a 70-year-old woman who's had enough. I closed my eyes, letting the quiet beeping of the heart monitor lull me into a restless sleep, dreaming of the look on Amara's face when her house of cards finally collapsed. When did my son change? That question haunted me as I lay in the hospital bed, counting the hours until Monday when Amara would learn the truth. I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment Keith transformed from the caring boy I raised into a stranger who would send his wife to trick his own mother while recovering from heart surgery. I closed my eyes, drifting back through memories like turning pages of a worn photo album. Keith had been such a sweet child, always bringing me dandelions clutched in his small fist, his face beaming with pride, as if he'd found treasure. Those dandelions meant more to me than any expensive bouquet Amara could ever bring. Robert, my husband, died when Keith was only 8. A sudden heart attack, the same condition that had recently landed me in this hospital bed. Life has a cruel sense of irony. After Robert's death, it was just Keith and me against the world. I worked 2 jobs, receptionist during the day and waitressing at night, just to keep our modest house and put food on the table. "Mom, you don't have to work so hard," Keith had said one night when he was 15, finding me crying at the kitchen table over bills. "I can get a job after school." "Absolutely not," I'd insisted. "Your job is to study and get into college. That's what your father would have wanted." And Keith had done just that. He'd earned a scholarship to the state university, becoming the first in our family to graduate college. I'd worked extra shifts for months to buy him a decent suit for job interviews. The day he landed his first position at an accounting firm, I couldn't have been prouder. "This is just the beginning, Mom," he'd promised, hugging me tight. "Someday, I'll take care of you the way you've always taken care of me." For a few years, he did. Sunday dinners at my house, phone calls just to check in, help with yard work and home repairs. Keith was everything a mother could hope for in a son. Then he met Amara. I remember the first time he brought her home. Her critical eyes had scanned my modest living room, lingering on the worn furniture and outdated decor. I'd spent hours cleaning, cooking Keith's favorite pot roast, wanting to make a good impression. "Quaint," she'd said, the word dripping with condescension as she picked at her food. Keith didn't seem to notice. He was too enchanted by her beauty, her confidence, her ambition. And perhaps that's what attracted him. Amara knew exactly what she wanted and how to get it. After a lifetime of struggling, maybe Keith saw her as his ticket to the life he thought he deserved. They married quickly, a lavish ceremony I could barely afford to contribute to. Amara's parents paid for most of it, a fact she never let me forget. The wedding was all about appearances, expensive flower arrangements, gourmet food I couldn't pronounce, and a guest list full of people I'd never met. "Mom, could you wear something a little more modern?" Keith had asked a week before the wedding, clearly uncomfortable. "Amara thinks that dress you showed her looks a bit outdated." It was the first time I recognized that shadow crossing his face, embarrassment. My son was embarrassed by me. After the wedding, everything changed. Visits became less frequent. Phone calls shortened. When they did come over, Amara would make subtle comments about my house. This neighborhood has really gone downhill, hasn't it? Have you ever thought about updating your kitchen? Those cabinets are so retro. Keith and I saw the most gorgeous retirement communities on our drive here. Perfect for someone in your situation. Each comment was a tiny cut, barely noticeable at first. But they accumulated, leaving scars on my heart. Keith never defended me. Instead, he began echoing her sentiments, as if my home, the home where I'd raised him, where we'd built memories after his father died, was suddenly inadequate. 3. Years into their marriage, Keith and Amara hit financial troubles. They'd overextended themselves with a mortgage they couldn't afford, trying to keep up with friends in more prestigious neighborhoods. "It's just a temporary loan, Mom," Keith had assured me when they asked to borrow $30,000 from my modest savings. Money I'd set aside for potential medical expenses in my old age. "We'll pay you back with interest." I gave them the money. They never repaid a cent. Then came the grandchildren, twin boys who rarely visited. When they did, Amara hovered nervously, as if my modest home might somehow contaminate them. "Don't touch that, Hunter. We don't know when it was last cleaned," she'd say, loud enough for me to hear from the kitchen. The final change in Keith came last year, when I overheard a conversation not meant for my ears. I'd stepped outside to water my garden while they were visiting, and their voices drifted through the open window. "How much longer do you think she'll be able to live here alone?" Amara had asked. "I don't know," Keith replied. "Her health isn't great. Maybe another year or two. This house would sell for a good price, even with the outdated interior. We could finally upgrade to that neighborhood near the Mitchells. Mom would never sell. She's too attached to this place. She might not have a choice if her health declines. As her only son, you'd have power of attorney. We could make decisions in her best interest." There was a pause, a moment where the son I raised could have defended me, could have shut down this conversation about effectively taking my home. Instead, he said, "You're right. We should talk to a lawyer about our options." That night, after they left, I sat alone in my living room, surrounded by decades of memories, and cried for the first time since Robert's funeral. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical pain I'd ever experienced. The next day, I made an appointment with my own lawyer. Now, lying in this hospital bed, watching the sunset paint shadows across the sterile walls, I felt a strange mix of sadness and vindication. Monday was coming. And with it, the consequences of underestimating an old woman who had survived far worse than a scheming daughter-in-law. I closed my eyes, picturing Amara's face when she realized all her careful planning had been for nothing. It wasn't happiness, I felt at the thought, just a weary resolution that sometimes love means protecting yourself from the people who should have protected you. The doctor discharged me from the hospital on Sunday afternoon, a day earlier than expected. I insisted I could manage on my own, despite the concerned looks from the nursing staff. The truth was, I didn't want Keith or Amara driving me home. I couldn't bear to see the gleam in Amara's eyes as she walked through my house, mentally cataloging my possessions like items at an estate sale. Instead, I called Dorothy, my neighbor of 30 years, and one of the few people I still trusted completely. "Those ungrateful vultures," Dorothy muttered as she helped me settle into my living room recliner. "After everything you've done for that boy." I smiled weakly at her outrage. Dorothy had witnessed Keith's transformation firsthand over the years, watching from her porch as his visits became shorter and less frequent. "You're sure about tomorrow?" she asked, adjusting the pillows behind my back. "Absolutely," I replied. "Amara will discover everything when the bank opens at 9. I want to be comfortable in my own home when the storm hits." Dorothy nodded, understanding in her eyes. "I'll be right next door if you need me. Just call." After she left, I sat alone in the growing darkness, remembering the day I set my plan in motion. It had been 6 months ago, shortly after overhearing Keith and Amara's conversation about taking my house. The memory was still crystal clear. I'd waited until I was certain they wouldn't drop by unexpectedly. They never visited on Wednesdays, as it was Amara's spa day, and I'd called a taxi to take me downtown to Harriet Wilson's law office. Harriet and I had gone to high school together, though we'd lost touch until reconnecting at our 45th reunion. She'd built a successful legal practice specializing in elder law and had recently helped another friend with a similar situation. Velma, she'd greeted me warmly, ushering me into her office. What brings you here today? I'd taken a deep breath and told her everything. Keith's transformation, Amara's thinly veiled contempt, the overheard conversation about taking my home. As I spoke, Harriet's expression had shifted from friendly concern to professional determination. Unfortunately, I see this more often than you'd think, she'd said when I finished. Children who feel entitled to their parents' assets, often encouraged by spouses who see only dollar signs. But there are ways to protect yourself. Over the next 3 hours, Harriet had outlined a comprehensive plan. First, we'd created an irrevocable trust for my house and transferred the deed into it, with me as the beneficiary for the remainder of my life. The trust had specific provisions that would prevent Keith or Amara from challenging it, even after my death. Next, we'd closed my joint accounts with Keith, accounts I'd opened years ago to give him access in case of emergency, and transferred the funds to new accounts at a different bank, ones that only I could access. What about the papers? I'd asked. What if they try to get me to sign something? Harriet had smiled, a knowing glint in her eye. Let them try. Any document you sign transferring assets that are now in the trust would be legally invalid. The trust is already the legal owner, not you personally anymore. It had been oddly liberating, signing those papers and knowing my home was finally protected. For the first time in years, I felt like I was taking back control of my life. One more thing, Harriet had added as we wrapped up. You should prepare for their reaction. They won't take this well. I'd nodded, a strange calm settling over me. I know. But I've spent my entire life protecting Keith. Maybe it's time I protected myself instead. In the months that followed, I'd maintained the illusion that nothing had changed. I still hosted the occasional family dinner, still listened to Amara's subtle digs about my outdated home, still endured Keith's increasingly transparent questions about my finances. Have you thought about what you'll do with this big house in the future, Mom? He'd asked during their last visit before my surgery. I'm doing just fine here, I'd replied, watching disappointment flicker across his face. But it must be so much work, Amara had chimed in. Wouldn't it be easier to move somewhere smaller? We could help you look. I'd simply smiled and changed the subject, knowing they were growing impatient. Perhaps that's why they'd seen my heart. Surgery as the perfect opportunity, a vulnerable moment when I might not read what I was signing. Now, sitting in my living room as the sunset cast long shadows across the floor, I felt strangely peaceful. Tomorrow would bring chaos, but tonight I had the satisfaction of knowing I'd outmaneuvered them at their own game. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Keith's name flashed on the screen. Mom? His voice sounded surprised when I answered. You're home? Why didn't you call us to pick you up? Dorothy helped me, I replied simply. You should have called. We would have been happy to drive you. I almost laughed at the false concern in his voice. It's fine, Keith. I'm settled in now. Well, Amara and I will stop by tomorrow morning to check on you, he said. She has some paperwork to drop off at the bank anyway, so we'll be in the area. Of course they would. They wouldn't want to miss watching me struggle up the stairs, using it as further evidence that I couldn't manage on my own anymore. That would be lovely, I lied. I'll see you both tomorrow. As I hung up, I couldn't help but smile. They had no idea what awaited them in the morning. Amara would go to the bank, expecting to file those papers I'd signed, only to discover that there was nothing to transfer, nothing to claim, nothing to steal. I made myself a cup of tea and settled deeper into my recliner, mentally preparing for tomorrow's confrontation. For the first time in years, I felt not like a victim, but like a woman who had finally reclaimed her power. The house was quiet, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock that had belonged to Robert. I imagined him watching over me, perhaps, with a smile of approval. He'd always told me I was stronger than I gave myself credit for. Tomorrow, everyone would find out just how right he had been. Monday morning arrived with golden sunlight streaming through my kitchen windows. Despite the lingering pain from my surgery, I'd risen early, determined to face the day on my own terms. I'd made myself a light breakfast, taken my medication, and settled in my favorite armchair in the living room with a book I'd been meaning to read for months. The grandfather clock in the hallway had just chimed 9 when I heard a car door slam outside, right on schedule. I took a deep breath, mentally bracing myself for what was about to unfold. The doorbell rang, followed immediately by the sound of a key in the lock. They didn't even wait for me to answer. "Mom?" Keith called out, his voice echoing through the entryway. "Where are you?" "In the living room," I replied calmly, not bothering to get up. Keith appeared in the doorway, looking immaculate in his business suit. Amara trailed behind him, dressed as if she were heading to a fashion show rather than visiting her mother-in-law. Her face wore that practiced smile I'd grown to despise. "How are you feeling?" Keith asked, bending down to kiss my cheek. The gesture felt hollow, performative. "As well as can be expected after open heart surgery," I replied. "You really should have called us to bring you home," Amara said, setting her designer purse on the coffee table. "Keith was quite upset when he found out you'd been discharged. I highly doubted that." Dorothy was happy to help. Keith glanced at his watch. "Listen, Mom, Amara needs to run to the bank to file those papers you signed. I thought I'd stay here and help you out for a bit." How convenient. He would keep me distracted while Amara handled the paperwork. I wondered if they'd already started planning how to redecorate my home. "That's fine," I said. "Amara, there's fresh coffee in the kitchen if you'd like some before you go." Amara's smile tightened. "Actually, I should get to the bank before it gets busy. I won't be long." She gave Keith a meaningful look before heading out. I heard the front door close behind her, and then it was just Keith and me. "Can I get you anything, Mom?" he asked, hovering awkwardly. "Tea? More pillows?" "I'm fine, Keith," I said, studying the face of the man who had once been my sweet boy. "Why don't you sit down? We haven't had a real conversation in quite some time." He settled uncomfortably on the edge of the sofa. "The doctor said your surgery went well. No complications?" "None," I confirmed. "I should make a full recovery." "That's great news." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We were worried." "Were you?" I asked quietly. Keith shifted, clearly caught off guard by my direct question. "Of course we were. You're my mother." I let the silence stretch between us, watching him grow increasingly uncomfortable. In the past, I would have rushed to fill the void, to make things easier for him. Not today. "So," he finally said, "have you thought about what we discussed before? Your surgery? About possibly downsizing? This house is a lot for you to manage." And there it was. Not even 15 minutes after arriving, and he was already circling back to their plan. "Actually," I began, but was interrupted by the sound of the front door flying open. Amara stormed into the living room, her face flushed with anger. "What did you do?" she demanded, glaring at me. Keith stood up, confused. "Amara, what's wrong?" "Ask your mother," she spat, throwing her purse onto the sofa. "Go ahead, Velma. Tell him what the bank just told me." I set my book aside and met her furious gaze calmly. "I assume they informed you that the house is no longer in my name." Keith's expression shifted from confusion to alarm. "What? What does that mean?" "It means," I explained, keeping my voice steady, That 6 months ago, I transferred ownership of this house into an irrevocable trust. The papers Amara had me sign in the hospital are worthless. You tricked us? Amara's voice rose to a near shriek. No, Amara. You tried to trick me. I merely protected myself. Keith's face had gone pale. Mom, what are you talking about? Those papers were for our vacation. I looked at my son, sadness mingling with my resolve. Keith, please don't insult my intelligence. Those papers would have transferred my house to you and Amara. I'm recovering from surgery, not suffering from dementia. This is ridiculous, Amara hissed. You can't just... I can, and I did. I cut her off. And that's not all. The joint accounts you had access to have been closed. Everything has been moved to new accounts that only I can access. Amara turned to Keith, her eyes wild. Did you know about this? Did you? Of course not. Keith ran a hand through his hair, looking increasingly desperate. Mom, you need to undo this. We're family. This isn't right. Family? I repeated, feeling a lifetime of pain in that single word. Is that what we are? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks more like you and Amara have been waiting for the right moment to take everything I've worked for. That's not true, Keith protested weakly. I heard you, I said quietly. Last year, through the open window. I heard you discussing with Amara how you could get power of attorney over me and force me to sell my house. Keith's face crumpled, the guilt written clearly across his features. He couldn't deny it. You had no right. Amara's voice had taken on a dangerous edge. We've been planning for years. Amara, stop, Keith warned, too late. Planning what exactly? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Amara's mask had completely slipped now, revealing the cold, calculating woman beneath. This house is wasted on you. Do you know what we could get for it in this market? But no, you've been sitting here alone, taking up all this space, while Keith and I have been struggling with our mortgage. Struggling? I raised an eyebrow. Is that what you call it when you take luxury vacations 3 times a year? When you drive a car that costs more than most people make in a year? When you remodel your kitchen because the 2-year-old appliances weren't trendy enough anymore? Keith sank back onto the sofa, head in his hands. Mom, please, we can work this out. There's nothing to work out, I said firmly. The trust is irrevocable. No one can touch this house but me. Amara grabbed her purse, hands shaking with rage. This isn't over. We'll fight this. We'll get lawyers involved. Feel free, I replied calmly. Harriet Wilson. You remember her from my high school reunion, Keith? She made sure everything was legally airtight. But by all means, waste your money on lawyers. You'll regret this, Amara threatened, moving toward the door. Keith, we're leaving. Keith hesitated, torn between his wife's fury and the realization of what they'd been caught trying to do. Keith! Amara snapped. He stood slowly, looking at me with a mixture of shame and anger. We just wanted to help you, Mom. You're twisting everything. The disappointment I felt was bone deep. Even now, caught red-handed, he couldn't admit the truth. I think you should go, I said quietly. This isn't over, Amara called over her shoulder as she stormed out. Keith lingered for a moment longer. Mom! Just go, Keith, I said, suddenly feeling every one of my 70 years. I'm tired. After they left, the house fell silent again. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt a profound sadness. I had protected my home, but I had lost my son in the process. Or perhaps, if I was being honest with myself, I had lost him long ago. The days following Keith and Amara's dramatic exit were eerily quiet. I expected angry phone calls, threatening legal letters, perhaps even another unannounced visit. Instead, silence descended like a heavy blanket, wrapping around my house and leaving me alone with my thoughts. Dorothy checked in daily, bringing soup and company. Heard anything? She'd ask, trying to sound casual. Not a word, I'd reply. equally casual, though we both knew the silence wasn't peace. It was the calm before a storm. That storm arrived on Thursday afternoon, almost a week after the confrontation. I was tending to my garden, finding comfort in the simple act of pulling weeds and pruning roses, when a car I didn't recognize pulled into my driveway. A woman in a crisp business suit emerged, carrying a leather portfolio. "Mrs. Velma Harrington?" she called as she approached. I straightened up slowly, mindful of my healing chest. "Yes?" "I'm Jessica Moore from Lawson & Associates." She extended a business card. "I represent your son and his wife in a legal matter concerning your property." Of course. They'd found a lawyer willing to take their money, just as Amara had threatened. "I'm recovering from heart surgery," I said calmly. "If you have legal documents, you can leave them with me and I'll have my attorney review them." Jessica seemed taken aback by my composure. Perhaps she'd expected a frightened old woman, intimidated by legal jargon and official letterhead. "Mrs. Harrington, this is a serious matter. Your son believes you've made these decisions under duress, or perhaps with diminished capacity. We're prepared to petition for a competency hearing if necessary." A flare of anger rose in my chest. Diminished capacity? I'd like to see them try to prove that. "Ms. Moore," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "I have all my faculties intact. My attorney has extensive documentation of my mental competence, including evaluations from my doctors. Now, if you have papers to serve, please leave them. Otherwise, I need to finish my gardening." She hesitated, clearly unprepared for such resistance. Finally, she handed me a thick envelope. "Your son cares about you, Mrs. Harrington. He's concerned about your well-being." I accepted the envelope with soil-stained hands. "Is he? Then he has an interesting way of showing it." After she left, I called Harriet immediately. "They're claiming diminished capacity?" Harriet sounded more annoyed than concerned after I explained the situation. "That's predictable but easily countered. We have your medical records, plus the documentation from Dr. Matthews, who specifically evaluated your competence before we created the trust. Don't worry, Velma. This is a desperate move that will backfire on them." She was right. 2 weeks later, I sat in Harriet's office as she explained that Lawson & Associates had withdrawn their petition after reviewing our counter-evidence. "What now?" I asked, feeling hollow despite the victory. Harriet leaned forward, her expression softening. "Now they'll likely try a different approach. People like Keith and Amara don't give up easily when money is involved." The different approach came in the form of family pressure. My phone began ringing with calls from relatives I barely spoke. Two, Keith's cousins, distant in-laws, even Robert's sister Mildred, whom I hadn't seen in years. "How could you do this to your own son?" Mildred demanded when I answered her call. "Keith told me everything. How you've turned against him. How you're punishing him for trying to help you. Did he tell you that he and Amara tried to trick me into signing away my house while I was recovering from surgery?" I asked quietly. "He said you misunderstood," Mildred countered. "He was just trying to protect your assets." "From whom?" "Certainly not from himself and Amara." The conversation deteriorated from there, ending with Mildred declaring that Robert would be ashamed of me. That hurt more than I cared to admit. Similar calls followed. Keith had apparently been busy spinning his version of events to anyone who would listen, casting himself as the concerned son and me as the paranoid, ungrateful mother. Dorothy found me on my porch one evening, staring blankly at the sunset after a particularly difficult call from Robert's brother. "They're trying to isolate you," she observed, settling into the rocking chair beside mine. "Make? You feel like you're the villain, so you'll give in." I nodded, too drained to speak. "Don't let them," she continued firmly. "You know the truth. I know the truth. And deep down, Keith knows it too." A week later, I was grocery shopping when I ran into Mary Peterson, whose daughter was friends with Keith in high school. "Velma," she exclaimed, embracing me carefully. "How are you feeling after your surgery?" "Much better, thank you," I replied, genuinely happy to see a friendly face. I ran into Keith last weekend, she mentioned casually. He seemed different, stressed. I tensed, waiting for the accusation that had become so familiar lately. Instead, Mary leaned closer. Between us, he was asking around about refinancing options. Apparently, they're having money troubles. Serious ones. This was news to me. I'm sorry to hear that, Mary shrugged. Amara quit her job at the design firm months ago. Rumor has it they've been living on credit cards, that massive house of theirs. Well, it might be more show than substance. The information settled uneasily in my stomach. Keith and Amara had financial problems beyond what I'd imagined. No wonder they'd been so desperate to get their hands on my house. When I arrived home, there was a voicemail from Keith, the first direct contact since the confrontation. Mom. His voice sounded strained, exhausted. We need to talk. Not about the house or money. Just, please call me back. I stood there, finger hovering over the callback button, caught in a moment of maternal instinct. Then I remembered the cold calculation in his eyes as he'd watched Amara try to manipulate me into signing those papers. I didn't call back. 2 days later, a letter arrived from Keith. Not a legal document, but a handwritten note on plain paper. Mom, I know you probably hate me right now and maybe I deserve it. Things with Amara have gotten complicated. I need your advice, not your money, just a conversation. Please. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my desk drawer. Part of me wanted to believe him, wanted to rush to his side as I'd done, his entire life. But the wiser part, the part that had finally learned to protect myself, recognized this might be yet another manipulation. That evening, as I watered my garden, I noticed Keith's car parked down the street. He didn't approach the house, just sat there watching. After an hour, he drove away. Dorothy called the next morning. Did you hear? Keith moved out of their house. Amara's been telling everyone it's temporary, but Helen's daughter works at the bank, and she says they've missed 3 mortgage payments. The news should have satisfied me. Wasn't this the consequence they deserved? Yet all I felt was a deep, aching sadness for the little boy who once brought me dandelions, now a man who had lost his way so completely. I wondered, not for the first time, where exactly I had gone wrong. Autumn arrived with a palette of fiery colors and crisp, cool mornings. 3 months had passed since the confrontation with Keith and Amara. 3 months of healing, both from my surgery and from the wounds inflicted by my own child. I was pruning my rose bushes for winter when Dorothy hurried across our adjoining yards, a newspaper clutched in her hand. Have you seen this? She asked, slightly out of breath. I set down my garden shears and accepted the paper she thrust toward me. The local real estate section was folded open to display a familiar property. Keith and Amara's sprawling colonial-style house, now listed. For sale. Foreclosure, Dorothy explained, though I could see the bold red letters stamped across the listing. Helen says they couldn't work out a deal with the bank. Amara's moved in with her parents in Connecticut. I stared at the photo, taking in the manicured lawn and imposing facade that had always seemed designed to impress rather than welcome. How much of their lives had been sacrificed to maintain this illusion of success? And Keith? I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. Dorothy hesitated. No one seems to know for sure. Rumor is he's staying at the Holiday Inn on Route 9. I folded the newspaper carefully and handed it back to her. Thank you for telling me. That night, I sat on my porch, watching the sunset, thoughts circling like autumn leaves in the wind. Despite everything, Keith was still my son, the boy I'd raised alone, the child I'd sacrificed everything for. Could I simply let him flounder? But there was another voice, too, one that had grown stronger these past few months. It reminded me that love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's surrender. and I had surrendered for too long. The next morning, I made a decision. I wasn't going to reach out to Keith, but I wouldn't turn him away if he came to me first. It had to be his choice to acknowledge what he'd done, not another rescue from his mother. 2 weeks passed. The foreclosure sign appeared on Keith and Amara's lawn. Neighbors whispered. My phone remained silent. Then, on a Saturday afternoon, as I was baking bread, a hobby I'd rediscovered since my recovery, there was a knock at my door. Not the entitled entry with a key that I'd grown accustomed to, but a hesitant, almost timid knock. I wiped my flour-covered hands on my apron and opened the door to find Keith standing on my porch. He looked different, thinner, with dark circles under his eyes and clothes that hadn't been ironed. The polished veneer Amara had cultivated was gone, leaving behind a man who looked startlingly like his father in our hardest years. Mom, he said simply. I didn't rush to embrace him. I didn't invite him in immediately. I simply stood there, taking in the sight of my son, truly seeing him, perhaps for the first time in years. May I come in? He finally asked, his voice ragged. I stepped aside, allowing him to enter the home he'd once tried to take from me. He moved awkwardly through the familiar space, finally settling on the edge of the sofa, just as he had that fateful day months ago. Would you like some tea? I offered, maintaining a calm I didn't entirely feel. Please, he nodded, looking relieved at the simple normalcy of the question. In the kitchen, I focused on the ritual of tea making, warming the pot, measuring, the leaves, arranging cookies on a plate. When I returned, Keith was staring at a family photo on the mantel, taken on his high school graduation day. I was happy then, he said quietly as I set the tea tray down. We both were. Yes, I agreed, pouring 2 cups. We were. A silence stretched between us, filled with unspoken words and years of complication. Finally, Keith took a deep breath. I'm sorry, Mom, he said, looking directly at me. Not just for the papers and the trust and everything that happened after your surgery, for all of it, for who I became. I sat very still, weighing his words, searching for manipulation or desperation. I found only exhaustion and what seemed like genuine remorse. Amara left, he continued when I didn't immediately respond. After the foreclosure became final, said she didn't sign up for this. Packed her things and moved back to her parents' place. I heard, I said quietly. He laughed, a hollow sound. Of course you did. Small town. He ran a hand through his disheveled hair. I've been staying at the Holiday Inn. Lost my job last week. Apparently showing up late and looking like this. He gestured to his rumpled appearance. Isn't great for client relations. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, and meant it. Despite everything, I took no joy in my son's suffering. Don't be, he replied, surprising me. I needed this. All of it. He looked around the living room, taking in the modest furnishings that Amara had always sneered at. I lost myself, Mom, somewhere between wanting more and never being satisfied with what I had. I sipped my tea, letting him continue. The thing is, he said, voice dropping to almost a whisper, I don't know how to find my way back. For the first time since he arrived, I truly saw my Keith. Not the polished accountant Amara had molded, not the scheming son who'd tried to take my home, but the boy who'd once had a genuine heart. The way back starts with honesty, I said finally. Not just with me, but with yourself. He nodded slowly. I've had a lot of time to think lately, about who I've been, what I've done. He swallowed hard. About how I treated you. The worst part is, I knew it was wrong. Every step of the way, I knew, but I kept going. Why? I asked. The question I'd been holding inside for years, because it was easier than standing up to Amara, than admitting we'd built a life we couldn't afford, than facing that I'd become someone I didn't respect. He set down his teacup with a shaky hand. I'm not asking for money, Mom. Or to move in. I needed you to know I understand what I did. That I'm sorry. Really sorry. In that moment, I made a choice, not from guilt or obligation, but from the quiet strength I'd found in these past months. The guest room is available, I said calmly. You can stay for 2 months. No rent, but you'll help with the house and yard, and you'll look for work every day. After 2 months, if you've found a job, we can discuss a reasonable rent while you get back on your feet. Keith looked stunned. Mom, you don't have to. I know I don't have to, I interrupted. I'm choosing to. But there are boundaries this time, Keith. Real ones. If you cross them, if you lie to me or try to manipulate me, you'll leave that day. No exceptions. He nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, I said with a small smile. Wait until you see the list of repairs I've been saving for the past year. A tentative smile crossed his face. Not the charming one he'd perfected for clients, but something more genuine, reminiscent of the boy he'd once been. That was 6 months ago. Today, as I celebrate my 71st birthday, my house is filled with real warmth for the first time in years. Keith, now working at a local accounting firm, has moved into his own apartment but comes for dinner twice a week. He's quieter than before, more thoughtful, still finding his way back to himself without Amara's influence. Dorothy and her husband are here, along with a small circle of friends I've reconnected with. Even Harriet came, bringing a bottle of expensive wine and legal jokes that make everyone groan. There's no sign of Amara. Last I heard, she'd remarried quickly, another man with a nice house and healthy bank account. I wish him better luck than my son had. As Keith brings out the cake he baked himself, lopsided but made with genuine effort, I look around at this gathering of people who truly care for me, not for what I own or what I can give them. Make a wish, Mom, Keith says as he lights the candles. I close my eyes, but I don't wish for anything. Everything I need is already here. A home that is truly mine. A son who is finding his way back to honesty. And the quiet strength I discovered in myself when I finally stood my ground. Some lessons come late in life. But as I open my eyes to the smiling faces around me, I know they're no less valuable for their timing. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.